So next person to the stage is James Heda Wang, and I hope I didn't mispronounce the name. Let's see after. Hey James, what's up?
Hi Tim, how are you?
I'm good. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Well, technically, I'm not really James because I'm Chinese. That's part of my introduction. So my real name is like only the second part, which is Heda. So definitely Chinese is a different language with tones, but yeah, people call me James in my work everywhere.
Okay. Yeah, I had some Chinese colleagues and they were always trying to teach us those different feelings of how the words are pronounced, and we were always failing. I apologize.
But no worries.
That aside, thank you so much for joining us. And I think your talk is going to be very interesting for me personally, because I love the connection between creative stuff, how that then goes into design systems, and how then we then actually develop things. And so your background is also cool because I've been reading, right? Because I have to, present this. And you have like a PhD in fine arts. You're a designer, teacher, developer, all of the stuff. You seem very capable of talking about this.
Well, it's like, sometimes this seems like it's unrelated, like design and development. But after all, I think, this is part of my talk, that actually philosophically, we have a lot of things in common. And actually, we should use these things in common to actually connect a different aspect of a product together, like development, like design, like product management. Like, is after all, we're sharing a kind of like philosophy to work together to work on a better products together. So yeah, it's never too much to expand your knowledge base to another area. So yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. How about you just start your talk and continue exactly what you were saying, but then as you'll talk without me. How about that?
Sure. Thank you.
Let's do it. Good luck, James. I'll speak to you in the Q&A. Cheers.
Sure. Okay. So hi everyone. Welcome to my talk, A Better Design Dev Handoff Experience, Code-Based Design System. So let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm James. I'm not really James because I'm Chinese. James is the name like everyone's calling me in my work, in my university. Yeah. And I'm based in Madrid, Spain. So yeah, I also speak Spanish. If you want to ask me something in Spanish in Twitter, that's okay. I have a PhD in fine arts. So yeah, you can have some doctor jokes with me as well. I have 7+ years of experiences as a designer or a front-end developer. And currently, I'm leading the effort of product management and also the design at Sausage. We're a startup working for the business intelligence for the fashion industry. And yeah, just a small advertisement here. We're hiring, so we do have a few openings in our website. Feel free to check it out. Okay, straightforward. What are we going to talk about today, right? So I have 30 minutes, and I decided to basically divide my talk in 3 parts, and each of them is gonna be like 10 minutes. So first of all, I know that a lot of audiences are probably, a lot of people from the audience are probably like more of a dev background instead of a design background. So first of all, we're gonna talk a little bit about design systems. And secondly, like, of course, we're talking about a design dev handoff workflow here. So there are quite some solutions, like everyone's doing their own solution there. So we try to review a few of them. And then finally, making a code-based design system, which is promised, by the title of this talk. So let's go straight into the first topic about design systems. So when we think about design system as a developer, we probably think of like, this is the file, which is in Sketch or Figma, that's handed over by our design team, right? So this file normally contains like something like fonts, the typography we're using in our products, colors, like grayscales, and also the branding colors, the functional colors, And then we're talking about spacing, like margins, like paddings, like the grid system of distribution of our responsive website, right? And also we talk a lot about like digital materials and using shadows or transparency, translucency for like different layers of our product design. And we talk a lot, most importantly, in our design system, all of our interface elements and their variations or states. So we can assume that a design system is a collection of reusable interface elements, which is guided by clear standards, which is used to construct our product, like in different levels, right? So is design system a new concept when designers started to actually use Sketch and Figma? That's absolutely not true, because design system actually started at the very beginning when design was born. Let's just look for a random example here. Let's not use something that we're familiar with. Let's not use digital product. Let's use like real products, like this shelf by IKEA, right? In IKEA, you have this famous Kallax shelf, like everyone have a few. I happen to have one in my background here. And you can see like it's just a lot of like squared shelves combined together. You have those like 2x4, 4x4, or 2x2. You have all these kind of combinations. You also have this kind of accessories like basket fit right into a shelf, or like wooden doors or even glass doors for each of the blocks here, right? So that's a perfect example of design system. Why is that? Because designers use a design system to make sure there's a unified standard to guide product design, which means after I have this shelf, I want to put a certain size of basket in it, or I want to give it a door, right? So there has to be a size for that, and that has to be unified. That's a unified standard to guide product design. And then you need to maintain consistency across the product line. So which means like whichever products which has the label of Kallax in IKEA's product catalog should be compatible with your current Kallax shelf at home, right? So you maintain the consistency, even though you might have bought like a white shelf, a black shelf, or a wooden color shelf, right? All of them should have the same size in each block. So you can always make sure like, okay, so the accessories are compatible with my current design. Also, this is super important because if you want to iterate the product in the future, like for example, you want to develop a product with a similar design, but also compatible with the accessories or the components you have to be guided by a design system, right? Which is interesting because designers use design system to have a unified standard to keep the consistency in their design and to iterate their product in the future with confidence. Basically, that's exactly why us developers use frameworks like Vue.js, because it's based on components. It assures a reusability of all of the code we wrote in the component. And of course, it's less code to maintain. So basically, it's a unified standard for our development. It keeps our interface consistency, our feature consistency, and it's easier to manage. You can iterate with confidence. So basically, like as designers or as developers, we basically want the same thing. But in real life, when we actually hand off a design to a developer, and then after the development is finished, in the QA, we normally have some back and forth, right? Some details of the interface might be different. Some interface might have changed in now, but then it breaks like some consistency with some past features that we already have. Why are there so many back and forth in reality? But basically, as designers or as front-end developers, we basically just want the same thing. Which comes to our second part of the talk. We're talking about there are different solutions for design and development handoff, and each of them are different workflows, and of course, they have advantages and disadvantages, right? A most basic workflow would be you actually have a team which is in charge of design. You have another team which is in charge of front-end development, of course. So in the design team, you probably have a design system which guides product design. And in a front-end team, you probably already have components, and you use these components to actually form the screens or features in your product. But then when we're actually trying to replicate the product design handed over by the design team, there might be hiccups. Like, for example, all of the shapes or colors on the left and the right are slightly different, but not so much. Those are the details which are frustrating because we're into this loop of back and forth of talking about like how do we make the product like in the front end look exactly the same as our product design, or some details in the product design might not be available because those are not how the code actually works. So, a lot of back and forth, and it's probably quite frustrating for us, for everyone. I mean, for designers or for developers, right? So it's a typical syncing issue because like each team has their own workflow, even though it's basically having the same workflow down the lines, the two teams are not in sync. It's a syncing problem. So as many syncing problems we might encounter in different workflows, there are generally, just three kinds of solutions. It's either solutions with people, it's either introduction of a tool set to actually help you communicate, or you adjust your workflow, right? That's different solutions for syncing issues in a nutshell. So when we're talking about people, right? So we say that the design and development handoff problem is a communication problem. It also happens, for example, with the engineering team and the business team, right? So we have DevOps to help on that. Or for example, if your product actually has a lot of data feeds, you probably have data operations to help you with that. So like recently is quite some popular term like mentioned in the design world, like they're talking about forming a new team, which is design ops. So advantage is that it's a group of people which are specialized on maintaining this design system and communicate all of the design needs across teams, across product design teams and also the engineering teams. So you do have a tight communication. But disadvantage is that you need a larger team because normally when you're in a startup, probably like you have less than a half of the designers in comparison to the number of engineers. So with limited numbers of designers, you have to further form another team, which is not something that's like super affordable or super realistic for a smaller team. For like a team with hundreds of team members, probably you can do that. But that's one option, right? That's trying to solve this problem from the perspective of people. But we can also introduce a middle step by using some tools like in between our design in Sketch or Figma and our code, you can add Storybook or you can add Framer, which are some tools that's mixing design and code together and try to introduce a middle step. So the steps in your workflow are probably clearer, but there are also a lot of disadvantages. Like for example, in Framework, in Framer, basically they're trying to support the best in React. But for example, like Vue.js is not fully supported in Framers, so it doesn't always work. And also because now we have one more step, which means the information about your design system is actually also distributed in one more place, which means there's more work on this workflow. And after a while, when your product eventually iterates, you actually also need more people for maintenance of this workflow, right? So probably like that's a good thing because like you can have a middle step where both designers and developers can understand in the same tool set, but also means like you added two more syncing steps in your workflow. So you also need like a relatively larger team to manage that. But how about when we're working as a startup, when we're a smaller team, we just form a squad for the maintenance and we combine our design system with a library of components. And then basically we use this design system to guide our product design, but because it has a one-to-one relationship correspondence with our component library, which means all of our front-end projects can actually use the component library as a dependency. So after some initial investments, because a design system is normally quite stable because a product design has its own guidelines. A design system is stable after you iterate after the first version, and then you just iterate with the need of your product design. So same goes with this code-based design system here. Basically, you just need to have some initial investment to translate your design system into a component library, and then you just from time to time need to form a squad with one designer and probably one front-end developer to actually do the maintenance of this component library, which keeps your design and your front end perfectly in sync. That's basically the idea of our code-based design system. So how do we make that? It's quite simple, right? Because our idea is to try to make our design system and components library sync. And then we use the component library as a dependency in all of your different repos for your product. Like, for example, you probably have one for the main product, and then you have another one like for your website, probably another few ones for your internal tools. So how do we translate everything design into a component library? You can see, like, for example, what's included in design systems, right? As we listed, fonts, colors, and so on. And then view component is quite clear. The concept is quite clear. You have template, you have script, you have styles. And that's why I say, like, maybe with view it's easier. It's more like, designer friendly as well, because the concepts are more understandable here. So it's quite simple. Of course, all of the interface elements and their variations and their different states are directly, each of them are translated into one view component here. But on the other hand, how about the other stuff mentioned in our design system, like fonts and colors? We just need to translate them to like CSS variables and or utility classes. Quite simple, right? So this is how our library going to look like, but probably we shouldn't call them components library anymore, because now that it also includes like utility classes. So let's call it UI library instead, for example. But in practical, you might need more stuff. Like, for example, our product, in the product of StyleSage, we have a lot of data visualization. And that's based on D3 instead of just view. So for example, how about these colors or fonts in our charts? What do we do, right? Because D3 is actually loading these in JavaScript instead of like in CSS. So we might need another variation of our colors and fonts for data visualization in JavaScript variables, for example, right? Or how about your product has some legacy here? Like, for example, you started your project without a designer, and by default, you probably use some of these like interface libraries like Quasar or like Beautify. And after you have a designer, you're probably like just trying to modify, trying to override some of the styles in these libraries. That's actually a main source of interface inconsistency, right? Because the override of the styles of these libraries are actually distributed in different places for products. So we might want to concentrate all of the style overrides to pre-existing UI frameworks in your infrastructure and put them in one place. So basically, it's still a hack, but it's concentrated in one place, which means like it's easier to inspect, right? So let's look at these one by one. First of all, like, let's say some components. Like, let's say for buttons, we probably have all of these different variations right here, like in our design system. But basically, you just need to analyze what's in it. First of all, like you have, of course, for each of the buttons, you either have an icon, you have some text, or you have both. So basically, you can translate these into the properties of your component, and also reflect all of these in your template, right? Quite straightforward. And of course, you have different appearances, like with shadow, without shadow, outlines. You have like different shapes. You have different sizes, right? So for all of those colors and shapes are basically, you can handle those with class, and depending on what's the property passed through this component, you can assign different classes in CSS for these. Like this example, you just pass the property of round as true, and then with that you just add the class of button round, which here we're using using BAM here, for example, and then that's it, right? And after all, of course, like other than all of like the basic styles and different variations, we also talk about states like hover, like active, like disabled in all of those buttons. So basically, this is like you just add everything we mentioned above in the styles of the component, and that's it, right? Quite simple for a button. We just took the most simple one for an example, right? But sometimes we see this kind of like conflicts, right? You see like on the left side is probably the button we just built. But then like in a card with some actions, we also have this button. But you might have noticed there's a slight difference because the button in the card is actually having less padding within it, just to make sure like it's aligned with the text and having less of a white space towards the corner of a card, right? That's a nice design detail, but might be very frustrating for developers. But no problem, because basically we know that this use case exists within the card. So we basically just override the button style within the component of card. So we know that, okay, this override happens here is because of the card, not because of the button itself. So it's still clean because card is just another component in our library. So there's nothing fuzzy there. It's just a simple override here, right? Easy. And then we talk about like variations and we talk about variables in CSS and also all of our utility classes here. So of course we have colors, right? And then we assign different colors in our brand, for example, primary or secondary colors of our brand to our text and to background. So basically you have some utility classes to use here. And also, of course, we talk about fonts. We talk about like different tags, like H1 to H6 tags, and we also talk about different font styles, like body, like subtitle, like caption here, right? Quite straightforward. And then we can also create some utility classes for spacing. Like for example, the best way for us to make sure everything aligns is that, we don't need our developers to know like what's the padding, is it 4 pixels or 8 pixels, because it should be something included in our UI library here. And basically when you compare like different spacings like paddings or margins, you just have your own way of like naming these, right? For example, we have a small spacing, which could be like, let's say 8 pixels. And then we probably want like the padding of all to be 8 pixels, or just horizontal, just vertical, or top, bottom, right, left, right? So we have all of these examples, and then you just have a set of utility classes like for spacing, which also could apply to like other like materials, shadows, or even like a grid system, right? Quite simple. And then for the JavaScript variables of your colors or fonts for data visualization, basically you also just include all of them in one place, and then you just export them. You basically, like for example, if you're trying to do like a palette of 12 colors in data visualization, instead of looking for each color, you just pass this array of like 12 colors, and then you just import that in your project, and you basically just call for palette 12, because you just need to know, okay, in this chart I'm using a palette of 12 colors, but that's already designed by the designer. I don't need to worry about that, right? So basically it's quite simple, because the result is just a UI library which includes all of these different items that we mentioned above, includes like view components for interface elements, CSS variables, and utility classes for styles, and then like also variables in JavaScript if you have some other frameworks like D3 for data visualization, and all of the override for pre-existing UI frameworks. All of them are concentrated in one place. All of them are in sync with our design system, and with our different repos in the front end, you can just use the UI library as a dependency, which means if your designer told you like okay, tomorrow we're changing the brand color to this new color, this like a blue color here, and previously you would say, I have to look for all of the places which are using this color. Not anymore, just kidding, because it's now synced in my UI library. I just need to look at the variables of colors in UI library and correct those, and that's it. 5 minutes, and that's done. So yeah, that's our result. But at StyleSage, we actually put this idea into practice. So this is actually an initiative that's already in StyleSage and still happening. So just to give you some numbers here, like what we did, and the result is that we saved more than 18,000 lines of code from the StyleSage website. But more impressively, we saved 40,000 more codes from our main product, our StyleSage platform. So this is like something that's actually making both the design and the product engineering team happier, right? So we come to our conclusion that we talked about these 3 things today. And for design system, designers use design system to make sure their design is easier to maintain and to iterate. Basically, it's the same philosophy as the frameworks and component that we use as front-end developers. And then secondly, we talked about different solutions for design and development handoff. So it depends on the size of our team. There are different options here. But basically, the code-based design system that we proposed today is pretty practical. It's even working for smaller teams, like startups, right? And then we talked about how to actually do this workflow, how to make a code-based design system, in which we translate everything to components, utility classes, variables, or override to pre-existing frameworks. And any further design iterations should be synced to the UI library that we created today. And we just need a squad to work from time to time, probably like 1 designer and 1 developer. That's it, easy to maintain after some initial investment here. So basically, that's it for today. It's as easy as 1, 2, 3. We just talked about 3 things, but I think it's a really good idea, and our team loves it. Okay, so thank you. That's all for my talk, and here are some links of my social networks if you want to talk with me. Yeah, we can talk in Chinese, we can talk in English, we can talk in Spanish. So yeah, thank you. That's all for today.
Wow, that was great, man. You mind if I stick to English?
Sure, of course. Of course we can.
There we go. You know what? I saw the whole talk, of course, I have to, and I really enjoyed it. And you kind of described how I work in my work, because I've worked on huge programs, like building 800 websites for L'Oreal, and all with the same tech stack, but with different brands and different designs. But we needed a system. And you kind of explained the way we went, but it wasn't really getting there because we had just too many people, too many opinions. It was hard, right?
Right.
And then I started thinking, when you started to show the class names and stuff, wouldn't something like Tailwind plus a bit of extra thought, wouldn't that solve this whole problem? What do you think?
Right. So the thing here is like, yeah, you could probably like start your project with Tailwind, which like of course includes a lot of like all of these utility classes or similar to what I mentioned. But the real challenge is always that probably like the creative people, like the designers, probably want to like have a slight like modified version of that, right?
Of course.
So that's the challenge. It's a similar thought. Like, of course, maybe you have used some heavier like UI frameworks like Quasar or Beautify we mentioned here, because basically all of those are basically following the same logic as material design, right? That's
Yeah,
you
sure.
know, that's basically like everyone's using. Like that's basically like a kind of standard, like de facto standard for web design or for app design of today. But there are always variations. That's what I'm trying to say. Like talking about the last part of your component library or UI library here. Because what if you want to do some override? What if you want to do some configuration? You want to do some variation of anything you use, right? In there, the real challenge is that once you have several repos of your front end, right? For example, you might have a website, you might have a product, you might have some internal tools. You need to modify all of these, like in each of them. So what if, like, for example, for one of the internal tools, we didn't touch it for a while, and then in the meantime, like the variations or changings of the design proposed by the designer was actually happening in different places, right? So that's how we see like frustrations. That's how we see like there's differences in different projects.
You're describing my life, man. This is crazy. This is really interesting because this stuff really happens. And the more skill you get, the harder it is. And so when you think about this, like how does it work with, because creative people and technologists have overlap in their brains, but there's also a true difference.
Right.
And so do you feel like the way you just explained stuff, do creative people actually feel comfortable with that stuff?
Well, I do think so, because one good thing about being a designer, like normally a good designer is quite organized, right? Normally a good designer is quite organized about their thoughts. They normally have, like, for example, have notebooks with all of the like the drawings, and then they use like, for example, they use Notion to actually save their ideas. They actually use a design system within the design team, right? To actually make sure like all of the designs are consistent. Because like if you have a joke about like designers, is like a lot of designers are having kind of like an OCD there, right? Even you can see like real life example of designers, like all of their devices are actually, for example, in the same color. So actually
I know this. I have friends with color-coded icons on their phones and stuff.
Right.
Right? Yes, you're right.
So I think actually it's something that would probably make the designer's life easier or happier, because they do want consistency across the whole product. That's exactly the reason why as designers we use design system, but only internally. Now we're just open it up. We try to apply the same logic, because design systems and component are sharing the same logic, which is to keep consistency, I believe.
And so I have a question then, because it might be a challenging one, because I've been working at agencies, tech agencies, ad agencies for like 15 years. And I have never had consistent design in any project. And not that the designers weren't good. They were like the best storytellers I know. Because when you work for Nike or Chanel, you better bring it, right?
Right.
But how come that when we start building, it is still not what you are now explaining? Might it just be bad tooling? Like, I wonder where it breaks.
Yeah, so basically, like, it's also about like the shelf life of a certain product, right? Because when we're talking about a product, we talk about like, of course, different things. Some of them have a shorter shelf life. Like, for example, when you're in an agency and you're probably doing a creative project for like for a larger brand, or for example, like some kind of campaign which lasts for a few months. Because like the shelf life for those products in agencies sometimes are shorter, not all the time, but sometimes are shorter. So the real issue, like when you're building your own product, or you're working on the same product for a very long time, versus the idea of like you're working in an agency and probably working at several products like from time to time, is because, you know, maybe your design system itself has a shorter shelf life. Or for example, maybe the maintenance is limited. It's not unlimited. It's not like you're working on your own product and you have to solve all of the product problems or feature requests that's coming up. That's the difference, because it's a different business model. I believe it's a different shelf life of the design. I believe, like, even in agencies now, they're also using the same tool set as a startup. Like for example,
Yeah.
everyone is migrating from Sketch to Figma, because Figma is actually covering a lot more in your design workflow. It's actually communicating much better with the other teams that you
Yeah.
hire, right? So basically, I believe it's more, the shelf time or the
Okay.
maintenance period. Yeah.
That actually makes a lot of sense now that I think back at it, because I now work at a startup. And so I
Mhm.
see the difference, right? And you're actually
Right.
right. It's the shelf life, because I can see creative directors shouting at designers to change stuff like 6 times a day,
Right.
right? So if you then have 5 of those projects, yes, of course, it's not going to be super stable. Interesting. And so in your story, where does a tool like Zeppelin fit?
So before, we used to use Zeppelin, like actually a long time ago, when we didn't have this code-based design
Exactly.
system. So
Hmm.
first of all, like for example, you just import like design files. In that moment, we used to use like Sketch, for example. Of course, now like Figma is better, right? We
Yeah.
import the files and it's in Zeppelin, and then we just comment there. We just use the conversation like between designers and developers. But the real issue is that, after all, Zeppelin is still a design tool, not
Yeah.
like a utility for developers, which means sometimes it is not like, actually your consistency kind of breaks there. Imagine, like, for example, in your design file, you probably have 5 things in a grid, and actually
Hmm.
you're probably using like a 12 column like grid system, right? Zeppelin is not going to tell you that. Zeppelin is going to tell, okay, between this card and the next one, you have 8 pixels,
True. Yeah.
right? So those are numbers. But our idea of using this UI library from the beginning is to eliminate the need to inform our developers about these numbers. Because if you have to say, okay, there are spaces like 12 pixels between 2 elements, maybe 4 of them are paddings and 8 of them are actually margins for whatever reason. That's not something visible in Zeppelin, because Zeppelin, after all, is a design tool. It's measuring like numbers and show you the numbers, but it doesn't express like the correlationship between the numbers. Like, for example, why is this spacing like double the size of that? But instead, it's just like static numbers you can use, which is actually the main reason why the interface consistency is broken. So the first thing we actually, when we started on this workflow, is that, okay, we should stop relying on tools like Zeppelin. That's the
Dude,
first thing we did.
you changed my complete perception in like 4 sentences. This is awesome, because I know the guys at Zeppelin really well, and we work together quite a bit. And
Mhm.
I keep on trying to also explain, hey, you need a bit more technical focus, like maybe import data and then look at specific variations of components and really show the tech people what it is, rather than just click inspect and hope the CSS works. But
Right.
you took it a step further, and this is great. Thank you for that. I hope the audience also had the same revelation as I just had. But that makes
Thank
a
you
lot
so
of
much.
sense. That is great.
Thank
So
you.
we have a bit of time, so I'm gonna have a look at the questions in the Q&A session to see if we can do something with that. So
Sure.
first one is from Samuel. Hey James, do you think we will see the rise of design ops, maybe now or anytime soon?
So the thing is, like, because yeah, of course we're gonna see more and more design ops, because like it's an effective way when you're having a huge scale, when you're managing like maybe several product in your product line, like you based on the same design system, because it's a centralized team instead of like a centralized workflow or centralized tool, as we mentioned. Is actually basically the larger way of managing. Imagine like you're in a team of thousands of people, when you're not clear about something in design consistency, they're the guys to ask, right? They're the team to be responsible of this. So they're gonna play a similar role in the communication between the creative teams and the engineering teams, just like what DevOps does in between the engineering teams and the business team. So I do see a rise there. But on the other hand, normally for any team, normally we have more engineers than designers, which means like maybe the specialization of each different like engineering team is happening earlier than the specialization of the different roles in the design workflow. Probably you have double the size of an engineering team in comparison to the design team. So I would say like design ops is probably something more suitable when you're like growing towards a larger team. But if you actually have some, centralized tool or centralized workflow like what we did today, it's easier to hand over this workflow to a team that's responsible for that, which is design ops. So this is a good basis. Yeah.
And so would it be a job title, or would it just be a shared responsibility between different disciplines?
Yeah, I think like transdisciplinarity.
Yes.
Yeah, that's such a long word. Yeah, sorry, not the native
word of the day.
Yeah, not native speaker. So that I think that's the trend, or that's what's gonna happen in this industry for a very long time, because it's not only about between teams, it's about how our industry is. Because basically, like when you're talking about a traditional product, a traditional workflow, a traditional industry, you just add internet on it. You just add informatic tech. You just add tech on it. It's a new industry. It's a new product.
Yeah.
Which means like ourselves, like as a team, we're already like across different disciplines, right? Of course, like when we work together, we should be flexible. We should, try to work hand in hand. We should at least try to know like how's everyone's working, like how's the logic of everyone. When I'm like, product management, design, and engineering are probably like a triangle relationship. But as a designer, you might want to know how a product manager is working, how the engineers are actually working, so you can be a better designer. Same goes to the other two perspectives. So I believe so. Yeah.
This is great. I always call this helicopter view, to actually know what other people in different disciplines do, because you really impact them with whatever you do. Right. So I love how you came up with that, and then we have similar ideas there. So let's have a look. So there's one question from Sibren that I'll just try to combine a bit. So he's not ready to get a PhD, but can you get some resources about this and share them? Maybe you have some white paper or some ideas or blog posts or anything, because it's a really interesting subject.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, my thesis of my PhD is about like combining the design system of software and hardware.
Cool.
So basically, having like having the same design system across like different design teams. So that's basically my thesis for my PhD degree. I'll look for a link. I can probably share that in I'm not sure in joined in probably, like, or somewhere else.
You can probably add it to your talk. I think that's possible.
Sure, I'll add that to my talk. Yeah.
So that's some not so light but awesome reading, Sibren. There's one last question.
300 pages, not too much.
Yeah, 300. There we go. Okay, so this is from Anonymous. In your opinion, in the workflow you describe, is more maintainable to write style classes in separate files, or to write them inside the UI component style section?
So it depends. It depends on, like, for example, if the style is actually only related to that component, then it should live within the component, right? But on the other hand, when we talked about like variables and utility classes, it's exactly because like maybe they are more than just something fit into a component. Like, for example, the same style in the title of a card might be just the same style as, let's say, an H4, right? In your project. So you need to have both. You probably like you can use, you know, maybe the utility class of like text h4 as, you know, the title of the card, but because the card is a component itself and you just already pass the title as a property to that card component, which means actually the text h4 utility classes is also applied within your component library. And then when you does add a card to your product, you don't need to worry about what style does the card title actually has, right? So it's not conflicting. You can have both at the same time.
Exactly. I like it. And potentially, if something is specifically scoped to a thing you do, you can do it in your view component and the rest make it global.
Right. Exactly. Like, for example, the example I took in my talk, like the button within a card is not appearing anywhere else. So just there.
Yeah, great. Dear Anonymous, I hope that helped. So, James, thank you for your time and your really insightful answers. I'm going to look forward to reading your thesis, or at least part of it, I guess. This was great. Is there anything you still wanted to share before we go into our coffee break?
Sure. Yeah. Maybe I'll just share like one thing, right?
Sure.
So, you know, as designers, we always talk about like user experiences. But actually, when we think about user experience, actually our developers are the first people who are actually using our work. They're like the direct handoff person after our workflow. So I would say that, you know, developer or engineering experience is also something that every designer should be interested in, because they're the users of your work, which means better developer experience is a huge initiative for a good designer in the sense of like user experience. So same goes with engineers. I guess, like, you know, you just need to try to get to know how your colleagues are working and make their life easier. So I think that's super important in a collaborative team.
That is a great bombshell to end with. And I think it's actually really insightful as well. So thanks, James. And
thank you so
we
much.
hope to see you in more conferences, because this is really important to talk about. Cheers.
Thank you so much. And everyone, please take care and stay safe, and hope to see you like in real life next year. Thank you so much.
Exactly. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.